Welcome to Reality, the official show of Atheists United. For the next 30 minutes, sit back, relax, and take a deep breath of the fresh air of reason. Our show will begin after this brief message.
Dr. Stephen Morris, usually a very serious fellow, as befits a college professor, was in a much lighter mood at a winter solstice celebration where he delighted his audience with the dumbest story ever told.
Now that it's Christmas, you sometimes do hear the story of Christmas told, the gospel story, and they try to make it sound rather rational, but they do this by taking the story and presenting it only in a very certain way, a way that emphasizes what they want emphasized and to ignore the things that they don't much care for. Well, I've had a look at that story, and they like to call this story, by the way, the greatest story ever told. It's the greatest story ever told. Well, I've read that story, and believe me, it's the dumbest story ever told. And tonight I'm going to tell you why. Okay. The Christmas story, the birth and young life of their Jesus, is mentioned in only two of the four Gospels, the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew. The other two don't seem to consider this worth mentioning. And the Gospel of Matthew starts out with a bang, literally, or actually a bunch of bangs. It begins with the begats. Okay, this guy begat that guy. No women, of course, just men begetting each other. And in Matthew, it ends up by saying, and Jacob, remember that name, and Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary. And this is the genealogy of Jesus. Well, there's a problem with this, and that is that Luke has a genealogy as well, and it says Jesus, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, which was the son of Heli. Not of Jacob, of Heli. The two genealogies disagree. In fact, if you look at these two genealogies, that's not the only problem. I've actually bothered to write these out. Some of you will, you'll all be able to see this. Here we have Joseph at the end, the father being either Heli or Jacob, depending on who you read. You go further back, and you find that you get up to Zorobabel eventually, through 16 generations one way, but only 7 generations the other way. These were all elderly bachelors, I suppose, by the time they got around to it. You get to Zorobabel, Salathiel, but then you get, once again, who is the father of Salathiel? Well, there's Neri, and there's Jeconias, another person with two fathers. One goes back through a bunch of other men, and you finally get to Nathan and Solomon and to David. They agree for a while, but by the time you get to from Aminadab, up to Phares, where they agree again, you go through 5 men one way, but only 4 men the other way. Evidently, Aminadab manages to skip having a father completely and goes straight to having a grandfather. Now, if there were only one genealogy present for Joseph, we would not be obliged to believe it. After all, according to the Old Testament, there was enough warfare and the associated rape and chaos that in just about every generation of the Jews, there was a certain number of people whose fathers were unaccounted for. The ability to actually go back and trace one's ancestry was not at all possible to this sort of detail, even in Western civilization, where we've had written records for many generations. How many of you can trace your ancestry back to 10 generations? Probably no one. But there are more insidious problems in this genealogy than just the fact that it disagrees. Number one, since Jesus was supposedly fathered by the Holy Ghost, why are they even telling us about Jacob? They could have just as easily given us the genealogy of Pontius Pilate, because he wasn't related to Jesus either. It was Joseph. But the fact that this is only men listed in this genealogy is an influence based on what they knew, or rather what they didn't know, about human reproduction. One thing that people knew long ago, even before genetics and DNA and chromosomes, they knew that young women who did not have sex with men didn't have children, and young women who did have sex with men did have children. And this gave them the idea that the man planted his seed, in analogy with plants, into the woman, and she formed a fertile area to grow this male seed in. Well, we now realize that's false. In fact, the seed, we now realize, is the female part of the plant, even though the Bible talks about the man's seed. And we now know, thanks to science, that men and women contribute equally to the creation of the next generation. But according to this ancient idea, which was quite reasonable at the time, women are not ancestors. Women are enablers, but the progress of human society and the human story from one generation to the next does not include women among the ancestry, because women were simply the potted plants where the humans could grow. That's all that women were. They were not ancestors. And we keep this idea around with us today, don't we? I mean, who am I? Am I Stephen Robertson? No, I'm not named after my mother. I'm named after my father. I'm Stephen Morris. And this is not simply because that men were stronger, and if there was ever any disagreement about this, you simply punched out the woman to prove that you were correct, which is the old style. It actually was based on their ideas that you were not an ancestor. Now, we then continue with this story, and we're told that Mary is visited by an angel who tells her that she will become pregnant because, quoting, "the Holy Ghost shall come upon thee and overshadow thee." Rather graphic way of putting it, although fairly accurate. But once again, problems arise with this story. Now, the average Christian reading this would say, yeah, the Holy Ghost did this, yeah, no problem. But it would certainly be a problem for Mary, because there's nothing in Jewish theology about a Holy Ghost. There's nothing in the Old Testament about that. That's a purely New Testament concept. Now, what would Mary think about agreeing to such a thing, having sex with something so alien to her theology? Now, suppose, for example, that the Pope were to be woken up in the middle of the night by an angel, and the angel would say, "Hey, Popey, you know that celibacy thing? Well, that's going to change for you. I'm going to insist that you are going to have sex with one of the most important aspects of your religion." And the Pope says, "Well, okay, you want me to have sex? Who am I going to have sex with?" "You're going to have sex with the green patootie." Well, the Pope is going to say, "There's nothing in my theology about a green patootie. I'm certainly not going to have sex with any green patootie. You've got the wrong guy. You're from the wrong religion. You come back and start telling me something about my religion, and maybe I'm going to listen." So right off the bat, you've got this Holy Ghost as a problem for this story, which I would think indicates the story perhaps is not quite as accurate as they'd like to think. A second problem with, now Mary's more relaxed about that aspect of things, but there's another problem that I find in this whole thing, and that is how Mary comes about to accept this little proposition. According to verse 38 of Luke 1, Mary said, "Behold the handmaid of the Lord, be it unto me according to thy word." Now that's the King James Version of this, but the King James Version is rather coy about this word handmaid, because the actual Greek is in this passage is doule, which is actually a pretty good word considering the situation. And doule in Greek has only one meaning. There's no ambiguity about this. It doesn't mean handmaid. It means slave. She's saying, "I am a slave, do unto me as thy word." And there is a word in English for sexual intercourse when the woman has that sexual intercourse because of her status as a slave. And that word is rape. And a story that begins with a rape and ends with a suicide does not seem to me to be a good candidate for the greatest story ever told. The problems only get worse with this Christmas story when you consult the other story about this, and that is Matthew. And here's what Matthew has to say about this in chapter 1. Mary was found with child, so this is after this angel visit. Then Joseph, her husband, being a just man, and not willing to make her a public example, was minded to put her away privily. But while he thought on these things, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David. Now it's David who's his father. Oh, gosh. Fear not to take unto thee Mary thy wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Ghost. Now, once again, we've got this problem that Joseph is just as lax about this as Mary was in terms of dealing with this new concept of a Holy Ghost. But again, there's some problems with this story. Number one is that this advice that he gets is basically to say, go ahead and marry her, which more or less implies that when Joseph, this just man, was thinking of minding to put her away privily, that actually meant that he wasn't going to marry her. Now, I can understand any bridegroom's upset at finding that his bride-to-be is pregnant when he hasn't had anything to do about it. It's upsetting anyway, but certainly upsetting when he's not been part of the action. And yet, I would like to think that a just man would say to himself, well, whatever I found in this woman that was worth marrying is still there, and I will marry her anyway. I will not cast her out to be a poverty-ridden beggar and her child to be begging in the streets as well. But we are told that a just man was thinking of dumping her. Now, all this business of being a virgin, which he has to be, comes about because of an Old Testament prophecy that turned out actually to be a mistranslation. But the prophecy, as it is quoted in Matthew, says, a virgin shall bring forth a son and call his name Emmanuel. Now that's the prophecy, but they didn't call him Emmanuel, they called him Joshua, or what we now say Jesus, but that's the Greek version, actually called him Joshua. So after all of this, they still couldn't be bothered to actually obey what they were told to do. Now, a third problem with all of this is that Joseph gets told about this in a dream. An angel comes to him in a dream. Well, what a terrible way to communicate things, because if someone says, God or an angel spoke to me in a dream, what he's really saying is, I dreamed that an angel spoke to me. It's exactly the same thing, not only for the listeners, but for the participant, the person who actually experienced this. If we are to believe everything that we dream about, we are going to have rather chaotic lives. And yet this person seems not to have any trouble with this. Now, these burning bushes, these voices from clouds, doves descending, voices in dreams, why doesn't he just send a telegram? Well, people say, well, the usual excuse is, well, the ways of God are not the ways of men. Well, okay, I can accept that, but surely the ways of God should not be inferior to the ways of men. And yet with these burning bushes and doves floating around and voices and disembodied hands writing on the wall, I think he could have done a better job. Now, so I think that Joseph and Mary don't really come off very well, and that includes this journey off to the manger. Now, I can understand Joseph obeying the law and saying, well, there's a census going on, but he really didn't have to take Mary. He could just have said, hey, I left a pregnant woman behind. Her name's Mary. Write it down on the scrolls. Instead, he tosses her onto a donkey and bounces her up and down in the wilderness of Judea. If he had wanted to induce an abortion, this would have been the way to do it. But I suppose he felt more confident. Now, my last point in all of this is really the last point of the story, and that is this business of Herod, the king. Now, you all know that supposedly Herod killed a lot of children in Bethlehem. Actually, he did a lot more. According to Matthew chapter 2, Herod slew all the children of Bethlehem and the coasts thereof, up to the age of 5. Now, that's a lot of children that he managed to kill off. Now, let's to discuss this, let's all jump into Mr. Peabody's Wayback Machine. We'll go back 2,000 years to Bethlehem, and we'll have a little chat with a mother and father who are in their little hut when a soldier bursts in, grabs their kid, throws the kid to the ground, picks up a sword, ready to slice the kid's head open. We freeze action, and we have a little conversation with the parents. Now, the parents, pretty horrified. What's going on? Well, you see, there's a story behind this. This is actually happening all over Bethlehem. All these soldiers are going to kill these young kids. Why? Well, it's because King Herod got angry at some wise men because the wise men showed up. They were going to go to Bethlehem, come back and talk to Herod, but they didn't come back. Herod figured that he was being insulted, so now he's going to kill a bunch of kids. Well, why doesn't he just chase after the wise men or set out an army? Well, that's just not the way of the story, okay? That's just not it. Well, why did the wise men, these supposed wise men, why did they show up in King Herod's court in the first place? Well, actually, why didn't they go back? If they'd gone to King Herod's court, why didn't they go back? Well, you know that Jehovah of yours? Well, he appeared to them in a dream and told them not to. If they'd gone back and talked to Herod about things, this little incident might not have happened, but Jehovah talked to them in a dream and said, go some other way. You're the chosen people, lucky you. Well, why did they go to Herod in the first place? Well, now there again, Jehovah sent a star in the east, and sent them to King Herod, and that tipped King Herod off. He didn't know about this until this star which he sent showed up, dragging these wise men from the east. Of course, maybe any wise men from the south headed north into Russia, and wise men in the north headed into Africa, and they all got confused. But this lot of wise men wound up in the right direction, and they got to King Herod, and asked King Herod. And King Herod said, well, I don't know about this. But King Herod asked some of your rabbis, some of your Jewish priests, and they told King Herod. And so, if you want to know why King Herod knew about this and decided to kill all these people, well, it was actually your priests, your Jewish priests, your rabbis, who actually told them about this prophecy about Bethlehem and a great king. Well, wait a minute. I've lived in Bethlehem all my life, been, living here. I think if there had been a prophecy about my town of Bethlehem, I'd know about that. Well, now, here again is a little problem in that actually there is no prophecy about the town of Bethlehem. What is actually starting all this is a passage in Micah chapter 5, verse 2. Be thou Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me that is to be ruler in Israel. Now, in the New Testament, this is not quoted as Bethlehem Ephratah, it says Bethlehem. Well, what's this Ephratah? We can go to the First Chronicles, chapter 4, verse 4. These are the sons of Hur, like Ben-Hur, the firstborn of Ephratah, the father of Bethlehem. So Bethlehem Ephratah is actually Bethlehem, the son of Ephratah, the father. It is referring not to the town of Bethlehem, but to the person Bethlehem Ephratah, who, by the way, doesn't show up in any of these genealogies either. So, in fact, it wasn't anything about Bethlehem at all. These parents would have to say, my kid's got to be killed because some king who's tipped off by my rabbis because a star sent by Jehovah brought them there, and then my own God told them not to go back. Well, holy smokes, okay, well, we have suffered before, but if this is to bring a great leader, does that mean a new civilization is going to come about? Would some good come out of this? Will we get a civilization even better than the Roman civilization? Well, no, the Roman civilization is going to be followed by something called the Dark Ages. So you're going to lose out on that. Okay, well, Jerusalem. Will Jerusalem be rid of its conquerors? Will it be built up into a new Jewish civilization? Well, no, actually, in a couple of decades, Jerusalem's going to be conquered, and you know that temple you like so much? Gone. Okay? Well, okay, but our people, the Israelites, will we grow as a nation and become more unified. Well, actually, no, you're going to get scattered to the four winds, and you're not going to get together for, 20 centuries or so. Well, okay, but will this person at least unify us so we can be a light unto all nations, and people will respect us? Oh, no. That's not going to happen. In fact, the people who wind up following this new king are going to be called Christians, and they're going to be your chief persecutors for the next 20 centuries. And indeed, in the 20 centuries from now, millions of Jews are going to get killed just by these very people who follow this new leader. Well, time is of the essence. We're going to get back, so we jump into the Wayback Machine. The Roman kills the kid and lots of others. Now, this is a pretty awful story, really. For senseless brutality, you couldn't get any better than this. Now, Joseph supposedly flees to Egypt for several years until Herod dies. The only thing that I like about this story is the fact that it's almost certainly not true. For one thing, in the other version of this story, in Luke, there is no secrecy or flight. There is no slaughter of the innocents. In fact, we are told in Luke that an angel tells the shepherds who go to the manger, and in verse 17 of Luke 2, they made known abroad the saying, what was told to them concerning the child. So this was spread far and wide, that here was the exact child, and it was great, and it was just noise. A few weeks later, verse 22, his parents, they brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. Now, considering that they already know that he is the Lord, they could just put him in front of a mirror and save themselves the trip. But to go to Jerusalem would be the worst place. Of course, he'd get instantly killed if any of this nonsense about about this slaughter of the innocents were actually true. In any case, we have Josephus the historian, who wrote of those times, who delighted in detailing all the crimes and misdemeanors of Herod, never mentioned this little incident at all, which would have been his worst and greatest crime. Christians would not dream of waiting until their children reach the age of reason or reach the being an adult before letting them into this business of Christianity. Instead, we have Sunday schools and little performances like this that will force religion on people before they have developed any concept of the ability to reason or indeed to defend their young minds against such notions. And we see this in a lot of the public issues that face us today. For example, school prayer. Now, the whole point of school prayer is not to allow young Christian children to perform their religion. They could do that anytime they wanted to. The purpose of school prayer is to force children who are not particularly religious to perform this ritual daily or so often that it becomes second nature to them, and they never question the absurdity of telling an omnipotent God what they want or what he ought to do. They would rather have this hypocrisy of uniform action replace the honesty of diverse beliefs that young children have. That is much preferable to the Christian than allowing people to believe what they will about religion. Indeed, what I find most peculiar about the school prayer issue is that for the Christian, they are specifically forbidden by the words of Jesus themselves to perform such actions. If you read Matthew chapter 6, verse 5 and 6, these are supposedly the words of Jesus. And when thou prayest, thou shalt not be as the hypocrites are, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and in the corners of streets, that they may be seen of men. But thou, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret. And yet when the decision has to be made between actually advancing Christianity or obeying Jesus, the Christians uniformly say, let's advance Christianity, Jesus be damned. Although they don't quite put it quite that way. Another issue is this business of in God we trust on our currency. You know, here we have a typical piece of a $1 bill, in God we trust. Why is it there? It's absurd to have this on money. It's simply to force the concept of religion into the hands of everybody, whether they believe it or not. Another example of this sort of presence of Christianity where it does not belong, all these crosses we see outside. You can look out the window and see a cross beaming in at you. Now, there was a big deal a few years ago about an artist who created a photograph which was called Piss Christ, and it had a crucifix in a glass of urine. Now, I myself admit, no, this created a big stir. Now, I myself must say I don't have this on my living room wall. It doesn't seem like art to me. But what a controversy it created. In fact, the National Endowment of the Arts may be completely eliminated from the government simply because of that one photograph that so enraged the Christians. And yet, if you've ever wondered why are so many of these crosses that we see outside painted white, the reason is so that nobody notices that they're covered with bird shit. That's why they're painted white instead of being brown, which is the ordinary color of wood. It is the Christians who have arranged that tens of thousands of crosses across this land will be covered in excrement, and yet they complain about this one picture. Why do they allow this? Why do they make such a fuss about having these crosses? It is because they are desperate to force these things in our face. You cannot drive 5 minutes in any American city without seeing this cross. They don't want to convince you about the truth of their religion through rational argument or through force of example. That's not how they do it. By simply having it literally in the air, inescapable, something that you see every day. That is how Christianity manages to propagate itself.
Well, that's all the time we have for Reality. If you would like more information about atheism or Atheists United, please write to us at Atheists United, P.O. Box 57435, Sherman Oaks, California, 91413, or call area code 818-785-1743. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Reality.